You're good to go.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. I know it is the third session of a full day, but I think you'll find this one of the most energizing conversations you'll have. We have two fantastic panelists with us today as we tackle the issue of unleashing family and community wealth through land ownership. As we have considered the power, the problems, and the promise of heirs property, we have two panelists who can explain their experiences in doing this and help you craft a path forward. So first I want to start with Bernie Mazik, Age Before Beauty. I'll start with Bernie. Bernie has been a leader in the community economic development movement for 20 years, and he has served as president and CEO of the South Carolina Association for Community Economic Development. That organization serves the association and helps them with capacity building and serving as an intermediary for funding. They sponsor public-private partnerships and focus a lot of attention on public policy. Indeed, Bernie was the person who spearheaded the South Carolina Community Economic Development Act, which has had a huge impact in our state. He has served on a multitude of boards, but for our purposes, we'll focus on the fact that he is on the board of the Community Foundation, as well as the Center for Heirs Property. And now secondly, we have Dr. Karama Neal. Karama is the president of Southern Band Corp Community Partners, which is a community development finance institute. And they work in rural Arkansas and Mississippi. They focus on development lending, of course, and a lot of attention on asset building. Actually, they both work a lot on asset building, and they have worked a good deal on public policy. And in her spare time, Karama has helped lead the effort to adopt the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act in Arkansas. And so I want you to understand that Karama and Bernie, they know what to do and they know how to get it done. They have a great deal of experiences to share with us, and I think everyone will enjoy it. We'll talk for a few minutes and then we'll leave some time at the end. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end of the session to see if anyone has questions that you can pose to the panelists. All right. All right. So to get us started, I wanted to ask, let's start with Bernie. From a community standpoint, on the ground, how do you see heirs property impacting the community? How does that form of ownership affect the community, what it looks like, and how they progress with their assets?
Well, thanks, Faith. Thanks for facilitating. And Karama, it's a joy being with you. And thanks to Center and the Aspen Institute for this great forum. Heirs property along the coast of South Carolina and throughout South Carolina is, in fact, a true asset that is untapped. And it is one that brings about different perspectives from different members of the family. But the fact that heirs property exists in coastal South Carolina sometimes brings about challenges because the coast is a highly developing area. And it's a traditionally African-American community as well. And so you have landowners who have interest in land that dates back to just after the Civil War. But a lot of times that land had not been partitioned, properly partitioned to family members. And now family members are grappling with how they might address it. Some people know they have an interest in the property, some people don't. Some people have different perspectives of the role that the property should play. Some look at it from the standpoint of heritage. It connects me to my ancestors. It connects me to heritage and to the family going by. Some look at it truly as a wealth building tool, personal wealth building tool just for them. And some of it view the land as a tool for the future. You do have to understand different dynamics in order to be able to articulate to a family as to why you should come together, why you should pool your resources, pool your energies, pool your interests, and be able to clear the title so that this can truly be a legacy for the family going forward. And to think collectively about this asset. Heirs property, unless everyone wants to sell to a member of the family, it really will require the entire family to work together. And so the process of organizing and advocating and educating the family as to the true value of this asset, especially in light of the rapid development that's occurring, is really important. And we find it sometimes very easy. My family had a relatively easy approach to clearing title and understanding how we want this to be an ongoing legacy for the family. But I know of a lot of families that it's not that smooth. And balancing those different interests are sometimes a challenge. But I would say it warrants the true effort to try to get the title structured in such a way that it can be used going forward.
And so looking at the Low Country and the fact that we had this wonderful asset, of course, nobody wanted it 50 years ago, and now it's something that is in high demand. Karama, you're out in the Midwest. How do these issues show up in your community? Your volume.
So, yep, thank you for that. So I'll start by just making a small correction. Arkansas is very much the South. We're the South in culture and economy and history and every other kind of way. But I think your point is really valid. Like, there are lots of different types of property here, right? And you see heirs property in all of them. So you see it in timberland, you see it in row crop agriculture, you see it in urban and rural communities, you see it in some of the grazing properties that are out there for cattle, for poultry farms, for those kinds of things. So there is a wide variety of that. Some of it, like in the coastal area of South Carolina, is rapidly developing. Some of it is not. That neither one of those really exempts it from having some of the challenges that we just heard Bernie talk about. So those continue to be in place. I think one of the things that as we think about the heirs property work here and the work that I and some of my partners do, we're very thoughtful about it being, it is very much a challenge. There are some problematic aspects to it, but it is also, as we heard earlier, a promise. It is also an opportunity. And so we want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to take advantage of that. I think it's also important to recognize when we think about impact, that it happens outside of the family, but also to the community as well. So, one can imagine if there's an heirs property issue, whether maybe the property, it's a house in town that's not being well maintained, or a weed lot, or those kinds of things. You hear the phrase, if everyone's responsible, then no one's responsible. And so sometimes that's what happens when you have an heirs property situation, particularly if it's property that needs to be maintained. Who's supposed to mow the lawn that week? Who's supposed to make sure the roof gets fixed and the property stays dry, or those kinds of things. So, that has an impact, not just on the family and their asset and what the potential is for them, but also in that larger community. Who are the neighbors? Who are the other folks in the community? When we think about how property is used, the tax base is affected by that as well. So if you have property that is taxed based on how it is currently used, that can have an impact. If that property is not being used, and it's not contributing as much as it could to the tax base for that larger community. I think in a lot of the rural communities, that particularly have a lot of heirs property, a lot of them are low. The community itself is low wealth in addition to the family. And so having an increased tax base is really critical. The last thing I'll say, and I actually got to say this in the last session, but I think, for so many families, particularly for their larger families, it may be that the families are not based in those areas where the property is. And I think it really ties and brings back those ties to that homestead state or that homestead area. And that can really, again, have a lot of value, not just for the family, but for that community. I have relatives who ride through where our property is now, and all they do is ride through it because there's not anything for them to do. But if there was something for them to do, if they were engaged in that kind of way, they'd be spending hotel nights and buying food and engaged more, and that benefits everyone in the community in addition to benefiting the family. So I think those are important factors to remember as well.
And so, in both of your work with asset mapping and asset development, how do you help folks understand the true value of the property, not what the tax assessor says, but what the true value of the property would be to a family?
Well, a lot of it depends on what the family values. And again, that varies. You have some families that value the agricultural contribution that heirs property lends itself in a rural area. Some people value the timber. In South Carolina, the timber industry is one of the most lucrative industries in the state. And so you can have timber harvesting. Of course, it's not going to generate annual income, but there's a way of of that being a asset to the family, because you can also use that wooded land for hunting, and you can charge people to come hunt on your land. So there are ways of doing that from an agricultural standpoint. Some people value and are thinking towards the future. And Karama mentioned people who live far off who would want to come home for family reunions. We've begun to talk about, well, why should family members, should we rent a place to have the family reunion when we can build our own family reunion center? And not only we use it for our family, but we can lease it out to other families. So you can be as creative as possible with heirs property. A lot of it also involves thinking about what's going on around the property. In our case, there's a high impact development that is being developed around the property that we have. And so now we're thinking about how do we develop our property that is compatible to that development. Not that we want to develop housing, but maybe we should think about developing affordable housing, because we know the housing that's being developed in those areas are not affordable. Or maybe we want to have an agricultural frame to create a farmer's market. So you can be as creative as possible with the creativity and the vision of the members of the family. And that's exciting. Now, of course, coming to an agreement, that takes something else. But what we're seeing is that we have family members that are very creative and thinking very futuristic about the use of this asset and how it can be a strategy for the future of the family.
Karama, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think, it is absolutely critical. I would absolutely agree with everything that Bernie has said. In the prior session, you mentioned real quickly, we talked about law schools and how they can be a real benefit here. And I'll give a quick shout out and heads up to the Bowen Law School here in Little Rock. They have a business innovations clinic. And one of the projects that they did was develop a resource guide for people to think proactively about how they can use their heirs property. Thinking region by region across the state of Arkansas. What, is this something where you can do a solar farm? Can you do, camping, recreational camping? What are the kinds of things that are open to folks to use with their property? We've heard a lot already today about thinking, prevention. So how can we use wills and estate planning to make sure that you don't end up in an heirs property situation? Ideally, still retain your property, but not have it be heirs property. We've talked about title clearance and clearing, making sure that heirs property gets removed from that unstable legal status into something that's a lot more stable and manageable. But just as important to those two is also thinking, as Bernie said, futuristically, thinking about what is the plan for managing this property? What is the plan for managing that land? Are we gonna contract with the local utility to put a solar farm on it? Are we gonna raise timber? Are we gonna hire a timber manager? Are we gonna lease it out? What is the plan? And so I think there is significant opportunity. One of the themes here today is taking action. There's some significant opportunity to think really proactively about how people can use that property, because that's a whole set of opportunities that folks have to think about if they're going to invest the time and the money and the just psychic energy, frankly, to go through the process of title clearance. You got to know what you're working for.
So there's a lot of information here to share about thinking big about the potential uses of your land. And so Bernie, I want to ask you, particularly in this coastal context, how do you know if a piece of property is heirs property? Can you tell just driving by? How do people figure this out?
You can't tell that property is heirs property just by looking at it. You have some people who have lived on the land for years, and it's not until they may go to try to get a home improvement loan to realize that that land is heirs property. Or you may have someone that think that they have an interest because they've been paying taxes for years. And now they have a buyer that wants to sell the land and they realize, oh, it's heirs property. I'll tell you, there are parties that know that your property is heirs property before you know it, because public and land information is public. And so the best way to know whether your property is heirs property is to go to the tax office, the assessor's office. the deed office, and you will find out the status, the legal status of your property. Usually you're also going to get a tax notice if you are the taxpayer on the property, and you're going to see such things as your name et al., Bernie Mazik et al. That's going to tell you that that property is owned by you and others. So it's not just your property, there are others involved. There's also a clue that if you get a tax notice and says Bernie Mazik or Dennis Mazik in care of Bernie Mazik, that means that that property was owned by an ancestor, but you are the one that has been designated to pay the taxes. So just by looking at the property, there's no clue that it is heirs property. It does require you to take notice of certain immediate documents you have at your disposal, but also going to the master of deeds, the master in equity, probate office, probate judge, the assessor's office, and it's easy to find out. Now, it's not as easy to find out who all has an interest. That's going to require a family tree. That's going to require a little bit more work of you engaging your relatives to make sure that you understand and know who all are heirs to that property. And that's a whole different workshop. That's a 5-hour workshop to talk about that. And the Center for Heirs Property can walk you through that process. But once you find out and know that your property is heirs property, please don't think that all this is a hopeless scenario. There's, with a little bit of time, a little bit of dedication and vigilance, you can be able to clear the title and begin to use that property as the asset that it is.
And so, and Karama, if you discover that a piece of property is heirs property, what are the threats that people should consider as they could look at solar farming or all these other ideas of how they can use their land? Have you seen experience with that?
Yeah, so I think it is critical. And, you know, like Bernie said, you know, sometimes people will know it's heirs property before you do. And that definitely is the case. I remember meeting someone when we were trying to get the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act passed in Arkansas, who, you know, his what he did on a daily basis was scan the obituaries to see who had died and who he could potentially buy out. So he'd look and see, you know, so-and-so died and left 3 children, and he'd find them and call them and offer to buy them out. And so, you know, he recognized that heirs property probably, I mean, they were still in mourning, you know, they may not have even recognized that was happening, but that's what he was doing at that point. So it is really critical, I think, you know, as we think about how we work through the property, it's important to recognize what kinds of threats there are out there. Sometimes that may be something that's internal. It may be someone who, and I don't mean threat in sort of an intentional way, they may not have that particular connection to that property, sentimental, economic, or otherwise, and they just want the money out. And that's not necessarily bad. You know, you can still love them and welcome them to the family reunion, but they don't want to be involved in the property. That's okay, but that can be a threat to how you manage the property. Part of what we found when we were working is that before we passed the uniform law, in order to get the property cleared, we were concerned that without the protections that the uniform law would have provided, because we didn't have it passed at that time, that we would really open ourselves up to losing the property, that we might find a relative who, again, glad to find them, welcome to the family reunion, we love you, but they're not interested in the property. And if that person just says, well, I want out, now we end up with losing everything. And so are getting a mere pittance for it. So part of what drove me and a lot of members of my family and other people I work with to try to get the Heirs Property Act passed in Arkansas was really allowing us to be able to move proactively to get that to reduce the level of that potential threat through policy measures, so that we would have those protections if someone had that kind of situation. So I think it's important to sort of recognize what those threats are and what the potential mitigation. Sometimes it's a conversation, sometimes it's passing a piece of legislation. I mean, it can be a number of different things that you can do to mitigate those threats.
But Faith, with what Karama said, I'd also agree that there are people out there that have ulterior motives that are not connected to the family. And they will research to find who is a party or has an interest in this land. And they will approach those parties and offer some dollar figure and have them sign a quitclaim deed. And that party then becomes an heir, just like the blood relative becomes an heir. And then they know the method in which to force the sale of the property so that they can not only get their share out of it, but eventually they may buy the whole tract. And there are horror stories about that here in South Carolina and in other places. So yes, there are real threats to those who have heirs property. And that's why the center here in South Carolina, the Center for Heirs Property Preservation, has been so proactive with a lot of community education so that family members can be aware, can be forearmed, and therefore be able to protect this valuable asset of their family.
And I want to follow up on that point, Bernie. You mentioned the Community Foundation. How did you come to this work on heirs property? How did it become something that was on the Community Foundation's agenda?
Well, it's interesting, and we talked about asset-based development. When I started with the Trident Community Foundation, which was the name of it back when I was there in the 90s, we were working with communities, largely African-American communities, low-wealth communities, to help them prepare themselves to become prosperous. And a lot of times we had to work with them to help them understand that they themselves were an asset to their community. But we also, in that framework that the Community Foundation had adopted, this asset-based development approach, we also shared with the foundation leadership that not only are the people in the community assets, but the community sometimes have their own assets, but those assets are underutilized because of their legal structure. And that asset is called heirs property. Now, heirs property was well known. A lot of times we in the Black community talked about it as a little secret. Oh, I got heirs property. But then as we talked about this as a real asset and what can happen if that asset was made legal so that its true value could be unleashed upon the family, and that family and that community can use that asset to really build wealth and transform the community. The Community Foundation began to start exploring that, and I'd say putting its own social capital behind it, its ability to bring together stakeholders in the community that had a little bit more credibility, a little bit more heft, and start talking about this as something that we need to get behind, something that we need to invest ourselves in. Now, I was there when that seed was planted and we just began the conversation. After I left, Dr. Stevens, who heads up the center, she was there, and they really began to put the foundation's social capital behind this whole issue of heirs property, got the Ford Foundation involved to fund an initiative, got the Bar Foundation involved, got the various stakeholders that really could lend credibility to this conversation. And now what you have 15 plus years later is an institution that has grown and developed and have made heirs property the valuable asset that it is. And so, you know, we thought in the early years that we would never see something like this, but planting that seed, I think definitely now it's mushroomed into an oak tree that is bearing much fruit for the community and the state as well.
Right. Well, and I guess it was prophetic to use that oak tree as the symbol for the center, because it certainly has blossomed in that way. Now, you spoke about coalitions. Karama, how did you put together the coalition to have Arkansas adopt the Uniform Act out there?
Yeah, so I think, you know, really, like I say, it stemmed from my involvement of it, just stemmed from trying to help my own family recognize how we could move forward. Really, though, I think in the case of so many things like this, you stand on the shoulders of giants, right? There had been significant policy work that had been done in Arkansas before, Arkansas Land and Farm Development Corporation and others who had done some aspects of policy work in the past and sort of laid that very strong foundation to build upon. So we were able to connect with them. When I started this work, you know, it was really, like I said, we just wanted a grassroots effort. And so we were able to you know, talk at family reunions, talk on radio shows, talk on podcasts. We started a newsletter and sent that out regularly to folks. And I would say that for folks, it's in the chat already. So if you scroll up, you'll see some of the links that we shared earlier from the prior session that have the links to that work there. So we were able to really build a group of people who were interested in this. We were very intentional around communicating in such a way that people could see themselves in that situation, even if they weren't necessarily the target population, right? So even if they weren't the folks who owned the heirs property right now and were having trouble dealing with it, even if they weren't those folks, we wanted them to be able to see themselves in that situation. And we've had really good success with that. I remember writing an op-ed about a year ago, since we got the act passed, where I was able to share some of the work that we did and why we did and why it was important to me. And an older European American man came and said, this was my family. We had this same situation. And I don't know that he would have recognized himself in that, but that it's important to build those coalitions when you're trying to get legislation passed and trying to build that effort. So we were really intentional about, framing the work in such a way that it would be accessible to everybody. We were very pleased that as that movement really grew, two of the uniform law commissioners in the state of Arkansas took notice of that. And really brought it to the Arkansas Bar Association. That was in late 2014. Then the bar said they wanted to put it in their legislative agenda for 2015, for the 2015 legislative session in the state. And so they did that, and their lobbyists worked very hard, and we were able to get that passed in 2015. So it was one of these things where, the Uniform Act had been in circulation. People knew about it. The uniform law commissioners knew about it, but nothing really was going until they had that grassroots effort. And they could say, like, look, there are people in this state who really care about this, who are trying to make this happen. And that's really what encouraged the uniform law commissioners and then the Bar Association to take this on. And so, as we think about, again, this theme of take action that sort of is framing some of this conference today, I think that's one of these things. I like to think that that's a good example of what all of us can do in some form or fashion. I'm not a legislator, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an heirs property service provider. I'm a family landowner, like so many people I'm sure who are on this call today. And so I think we can really be intentional about how we act, what we do, and we make a change, not just for our own families, but for so many families across the state, across our region, across our country.
That's really inspiring. And so as you made these new alliances with bars and traditional community foundations, was a part of your challenge to explain to them why heirs property was a problem in terms of, what's the problem that owners face if they can't leverage that property?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it was that challenge. And, in my day job, I work I'm president of a CDFI loan fund, a community development financial institution. So we're development lenders with a focus on community development, economic development, and wealth building for individuals and families and communities. And, it is not unusual for us to have someone come to us and want a loan to do something, and they want to, put up their house, and from their perspective, they own the house. That's where they've been living all this time, but it's actually heirs property. And so we can't take that. We run what's called an individual development account program where folks save, and then they get some match money, and they then can use those funds to do things like repair a house or buy a house or start a small business or those kinds of things. And again, it's not unusual if they're wanting to do home repairs or something. They need to get their roof fixed, and this is an issue, and it's about to be tornado season here, and something like that is happening. And we'd love to enroll them, but we have to find something else because they can't show clear title to that. So, using those kinds of examples was really important. As I said, helping people see themselves in that work was really important. We had to pay really close attention to the language that we used. It was not unusual, particularly as we were building and talking with folks about this, that I would have conversations with people and talk about this work. Say, oh, this is really interesting. Tell me about it. And I'd tell them about it, explain what heirs property is. And they'd listen. And then they would say at the end, we have family land too. And they would talk about their family land, thinking it was fundamentally different from what I was talking about. But then as they were talking, you would hear them and they'd talk about their situation. And it was clear they had heirs property. But that was not a term they used. That was not a term that they were familiar with. They would not have seen themselves in the work that I was doing unless I explicitly made that connection for them. So I think that is really important when we're building these coalitions, to recognize that everyone doesn't use the same term, whether it's fractionated land or family land or heirs property. Not to say they all mean exactly the same thing, but for the layperson, not for the attorney, but for the layperson, oftentimes they are talking about the same thing. And we have to be really intentional about that so that we can build those coalitions.
Right. And so getting people to take advantage of programs like yours and government benefits that they pay taxes for, getting to clear title gets them to the point where they can access those benefits. Bernie, the challenge in Charleston is a little different. with high growth and development. So what's the challenge here if people can't leverage that property?
Well, in Charleston, South Carolina, you can't even get electricity or utilities run to property without clear title. So if someone wanted to put a new house or even a mobile home on a piece of heirs property, they won't be able to do it. So those are some of the challenges. But we have, of course, challenges with encroachment. We have challenges with high growth, but also in rural areas, we also have challenges there. We're now dealing with the broadband disparities between urban and rural areas. And so if we're talking about trying to get access to those resources and you live on heirs property, it can become troublesome there as well. So when we encounter folk with heirs property, of course, fortunately, we have the center, but we also are really encouraging people to be proactive and lean forward in trying to resolve the issues of heirs property. And of course, with the issue of high growth, you also have to deal with folk who are trying to involve themselves with unscrupulous tactics to get that property out from under you. So it's always having the family to be on guard, to educate other family members as to what you are party to, that you yourself cannot just sell your interests off to someone else, but you must think of the family as a whole. And so those are challenges that we encounter here in coastal South Carolina, but we also have tremendous benefits that families can take advantage of. For those who do want to convert their family into their land into timberland or to agricultural land, even while the property is still in the status of heirs property, they can access USDA resources to help them do that. And that can help pay for some of the legal services that will be needed in order to clear the title. That can help pay for the taxes. That can help you while you're trying to clear the title. So there are some challenges, there's work that needs to be done, but there are huge opportunities that can be realized as a result of that.
Terrific, terrific. Well, and I know I said we were going to spend some time for questions while folks have you here and they're eagerly jumping in. And so I saw a question earlier in the chat room, and it basically deals with young people. Are you finding that younger people are less connected and less interested in returning to the land and maintaining it in the family?
I asked Karama that same question when we were having our planning session. I'm curious as to her thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question. And I think that, it goes to sort of one of the things I said earlier, we do so much work on prevention around heirs property, do a lot of work on title clearance. We've got to do that work that is future focused as well. I think for a lot of young people, particularly in the case of, particularly if it's rural property that, maybe those young people didn't grow up on that property. In my family, for example, my mother was born on our property, my grandmother, my great-grandmother was, but I was not. I didn't grow up on that property, right? And so, I remember going to visit it, but I didn't grow up there in the way that my mother did. And so for folks of my generation, it's a different conversation to talk about that property than it was for my mother and my grandmother's generation who grew up there. That is home. That is where they grew up. So we have to think we don't have the same type of sentimental value, even though we have significant sentimental value, we don't have the same type of that. Oftentimes, particularly in rural cases, you may not have that same type of value because you've gone and you've moved to wherever, Charleston or Atlanta or Memphis or or Little Rock or wherever it is, and you didn't grow up in that spot. So it's really important to, I think about what is the land management plan? What is the property management plan so that young people whose sentimental ties may not be as strong as their parents because they just didn't grow up in the same space, they have something to tie that to. They can say, like I can say, and I think about my daughter when I say this, if I say that my great-great-grandfather, Griffin Henry Belk, wanted to make sure that property was always there, that his family could always have a place to call home. Well, mostly my family's probably not moving back to that town of 81 people. We're probably not moving back there, right? So we're probably not going to call it home in the same way he did and the way that my mother did and my grandmother did. But that doesn't mean that we can't cut the timber potentially and make it into a scholarship for the young people or make it into an asset for the young people as we move forward. So I think it's really critical to help and I'm not saying forget about the past, but align the future focused work with the past focused work so that all the generations can feel a role and feel involved and feel investment in what happens with that property, whether it's urban property, rural property, whatever it is.
I think also there's an opportunity to think about and draw in the ideas of the next generation. We do have a few members of our LLC management board that they're interested in the corporate structure, because as an LLC, you're operating as a corporation, and you have a board of managers, and that board of managers have policies and that it operates by. So it can be a training ground for the next generation about how to be part of a corporation. There's also ideas coming from all sectors of our family about what can be done with the property. You can create a hunting lodge out there. You can create a family reunion center. Or you can create affordable housing. So those are ways that I think we engage the imagination of the next generation. Of course, now it then gets to the point of agreeing. And like Ram said, the land management plan. Now you have to bring a professional in to help you negotiate those so that you can create a plan that is of best benefit for the future. But we're very interested in trying to engage the next generation to be actively involved in this asset now, because we got to get them interested now so that they can feel a sense of ownership to the family going forward, to the asset going forward.
Excellent, excellent. And I see there's a question here about appraisals and the Uniform Partition Act. I was able to participate in some of those sessions for the Uniform Act, and we did talk about this appraisal issue. And so there's an opportunity, if you have an issue or you're trying to do a partition in kind, or even a partition, if you're facing partition sale, you have the right to have multiple appraisals put into the record for the judge to then consider when they're determining what the value would be that someone pays you, or how to divvy up different parcels of property so that the value is in proportion to what your interest is. So I don't know if the center maintains a specific list, but I would certainly say it's always helpful to get a second or third opinion. Any other thoughts on appraisals? Have you run into that, Karama, in Arkansas?
I mean, it's definitely something we're thoughtful about. And I think, we're talking about the present, but, part of the reason we're in this situation as we are now is because there have been, frankly, unscrupulous folks who have operated in the past, and some may be operating now. And in as much as perception is reality, and as much as some of those folks still are operating in unscrupulous ways, I think we do have to be thoughtful. So I would just second the notion of, getting a second opinion, having multiple appraisals, being really thoughtful about it. One of the things that, that I've seen people do, that I've even done myself, is sign up to get on these lists of what properties are selling for. See what other properties are selling for, so you can see that. A lot of real estate, folks who manage that kind of big parcels of land will have lists where you can just sign up and get emails to see what the properties are selling for, because they're trying to get it sold, but you can use it for research purposes. What is a property in this neighborhood going for?
And I will refer everybody to their cell phones. Zillow is a good source of what people paid for it or what it's listed for. You can search that via a map, and people will call and they'll give you a number. But if you do your research and stay up on the value of land surrounding your property, then you can make an informed decision.
Faith, I'd also like to encourage those who are parties to heirs property or family land in general, is to stay informed about what the land use plan and the zoning that is happening in and around your property. County, your appraisal, your zoning offices, that's public information. You can go in and see what the plans are. And usually they're going to be public hearings held concerning if there's a development that's scheduled for your area, or if there's a rezoning that's planned for the area. So I encourage you to go and be proactive and to understand what's planned, what's coming, what's the comprehensive plan. In South Carolina, every county is required to put in place a comprehensive plan. And that comprehensive plan has to be updated periodically. And so when that public comment period or that public information period is offered, go and be a part of that and to share what your family's view and vision is for your land so that you are not zoned out, but the zoning takes in consideration your land and what your family has in store for it, what their ideas are for the future of that land.
And also check the highway department, because sometimes the plan for your property is to be a road bed.
Exactly.
And that's something you need to find out on the front end.
That's right.
And if you end up with that situation, they have to pay you fair market value. So you should keep yourself informed about what other properties are selling for so that you can receive fair market value if you end up in that situation. So yeah. I think Karama would say be active, be proactive, and Bernie's telling us stay informed. Any closing words from, I'll give you a close, Karama first and then Bernie.
I would just say, don't be limited by what your, what your or other people's perceptions are about what is possible. So, again, I just raised, I never would have thought that grew up in Arkansas and left for a long time, came back home. I never would have thought at that point that I'd be leading a legislative effort that would have been successful in about, 18 months after we started it. That was not my plan. And again, I'm not a legislator, not an attorney, it's not the work I do professionally, but it's possible. And I think I would just encourage folks to really be expansive in your thought about how to do this work and what is possible, and whether it's public policy, whether it's setting up a nonprofit because you see what the work of the center is and you want to replicate it in your state because it is a wonderful model, whatever those kinds of things are, just dream about what's possible, because it makes such a difference oftentimes for our own families if we're in that situation, but for so many more. And so just commend everybody for being here and for this gathering happening in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neal. Bernie?
I'm a student, a frustrated historian. I'm a student of history. And I'm often drawn to the history of the South, the history of this country. And then back in I think it was 1999, the AP did a story on Black land ownership in this country. We dated and did the research to find out that African Americans own 20 million acres of land, usually farmland and rural land in the United States. By the year 1999-2000, African Americans lost 2/3 of that land. So what I grew up hearing is they're not making any more land. And when you lose it, it is twice as hard to get some of that land back. So I'm an advocate for us to hold on to what we have and try to grow what we have, because an asset as such as land can pay dividends far into the future. So let's try to hold on to as much land as we have. And fortunately now there are tools, institutions, and resources to help us to not only keep it, but grow it.
Wonderful. Well, and as you said, both of you said, passing this down is the way to create intergenerational wealth. And so I hope that everyone has enjoyed the panel discussion today. Bernie and Karama, you were excellent panelists and really inspired everybody to get out there and not to lay down, but to take action and to be proactive in using this asset. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.